war crimes of the Russian army in Ukraine, illegal deportation of Ukrainian children, harassment and violence against peaceful civilians, torture and murders of unarmed prisoners.
International sanctions, embargoes and restrictions destroying the Russian economy. The bankruptcy of industrial giants and monopolists. Total decline in the standard of living. And the budget not for the people, but for the war.
Rewriting history and militarization of society. Destroyed freedom of speech and justice. Lies coming from TV screens, theaters, movies and cartoons. And total brainwashing by propaganda.
Violation of all norms of international humanitarian law, isolation and arrest warrant for Putin.
Cooperation with pariah countries and Russia's transformation into a commodity-producing appendage.
Watch what Putin and his regime have done to the state in a special report, Russia 2023, the results of the second military year.
The year 2023, the second year of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. It is the year when Russia has finally lost what remained of its reputation in the international arena. Its regime is officially recognized as a dictatorship. Russia is already in isolation, as all civilized nations of the world have turned their backs on it. Its allies are only the same pariah countries and terrorist organizations. And this is the main achievement of the President Vladimir Putin, dictator, imperialist and a war criminal. On his behalf, the Russian army is committing atrocities in Ukraine that make the blood of any civilized person run cold. After the liberation of the occupied settlements, the bloody war crimes of Putin's soldiers were revealed to the world. Bucha, Irpin, Izum, Kherson, and almost completely destroyed Mariupol. The scale there is yet to be recognized after liberation, but Putin, his generals and accomplices will pay for everything. 40 states have already supported the creation of a special tribunal. The International Center for the Prosecution of Russia's crime of aggression against Ukraine is already working in The Hague, and investigators are documented all the facts that will prove the genocide of the Ukrainian people by Russia. 110,000 criminal proceedings have already been opened.
They have no statute of limitation, and that means that they will be investigated all the time. If there is some evidence that allows us to identify a suspect, even if it is 20, 30 or 50 years from now, still, these crimes will be dealt with. For example, in Germany, they still try suspects who are involved in concentration camp crimes. Sometimes these are even people who are 80 or 90 years old. There will be a similar story with Ukrainian cases.
Kidnapping, violence, imprisonment, fabricated criminal cases and violation of all possible norms of international humanitarian law. These are the methods used by the Russian military to rescue civilians. Now there are 28,000 civilian Ukrainians in captivity, and these are only the cases verified by the Office of the Ukrainian Ombudsman. The real figures are many times higher.
We are aware of at least 16 cases of civilians who were abducted and tortured to death. The victims were human rights activists, volunteers who were in the occupied territories, also journalists or their relatives. Or it could be activists who went to pro-Ukrainian demonstrations against the occupation. These are called enforced disappearances.
By force, through deception and manipulation at the behest of the Kremlin's top brass, the Russian army is committing yet another particularly cynical crime in Ukraine against the most defenseless.
I have been looking for my mom since March last year. Her name is Kozlova Snezhana Mikhailivna. We were separated in a filtration camp in the village of Bezimenne. The Russians said that my mom didn't need me, that they would give me to a foster family in Russia.
Russia illegally deported hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian infants and teenagers. Russians being shown stories on TV about so-called rescue. They urge Russians to adopt those children. In reality, these children were literally kidnapped. Russia, having invaded Ukraine, first created extremely life-threatening conditions. Then it played peacemaker by taking Ukrainian children out of destroyed and occupied cities, possibly taking them from their families, detaining their parents in filtration camps. The scale of illegal deportation is shocking. The number of abductees may exceed 740,000. Ukraine has managed to identify only a small percentage of those.
At the moment, the International Criminal Court has qualified deportation of Ukrainian children as a war crime. But this crime can also be a crime against humanity and a fact of genocide. In the future, as the ICC conducts its investigation, collects new facts, they may add some additional qualifications.
Ukrainian children are illegally adopted in Russia, and their identity is being erased. Their native language is forbidden. They are taught to hate Ukraine and love the Russian president, to send them to war when they reach adulthood. The world recognizes these actions as an element of Russia's state policy. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has set up a special committee on Ukrainian children. Also, a coalition for the return of deportees has been set, and the International Criminal Court has already issued an arrest warrant for the Russian president, as well as for his henchwoman, the Children's Rights Commissioner.
Vladimir Putin is now an official suspect for war crimes in Ukraine. It is for the crimes for deporting Ukrainian children that he is internationally wanted. He should have been detained on the territory of any of the 124 countries that have ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Brazilian President Lula da Silva has already said that he is inviting Vladimir Putin to the G20 summit, but he cannot guarantee that he will not be arrested.
In the Russian case of war crimes, which the whole world is demanding to punish, there are cynical executions and brutal torture of unarmed Ukrainian soldiers. They revealed the real, that is, sadistic face of the Kremlin owner's army, destroying myths about its high spirituality.
Glory to Ukraine.
Putin's soldiers violated all the customs of warfare and all norms of the Geneva Conventions.
It is enough just to watch television reports that show how our prisoners of war are returning, what kind of physical condition they are in, how exhausted they are, or, for example, when they see an apple for the first time in many months. If we talk about the Russian prisoners of war held by the Ukrainian side, Ukraine respects the Geneva Conventions, international law, and provides access to the Russian prisoners of war held in Ukraine.
Putin has ignored all the calls of the international community to withdraw troops and end the war. The Russian army continues to commit horrific crimes, attacking Ukrainian towns and villages, killing and maiming Ukrainian military personnel and civilians. This has already labeled Russia as a terrorist state. The shelling of the power stations and generators is not military infrastructure. It is what makes towns and villages live. The destruction of, for example, residential buildings and schools is an explicit war crime, as well as the attacks on medical facilities, torture, sexual violence, and using people as civilian shells, which is why we say that Russia very often acts like a terrorist state.
But the world does not intend to forgive Putin for the atrocities of his army in Ukraine. Russia is already reaping the fruits of war for the second year and paying for Putin's imperialism. It has become the most under-sanctioned country in the world. Its economy is being systematically destroyed. Now it literally needs a donor, otherwise it will not last long. Russians' main revenues from oil and gas sales have fallen by half. The monopoly giant Gazprom, which used to be one of the richest companies in the world, has become loss-making, and it has to simply burn a significant part of its gas. The country's budget, which was generously financed by oil and gas production, is bursting at the seams. This is the result of the sanctions, which came into full effect just at the beginning of 2023. The imposition of an oil price ceiling and embargo on Russian oil products have hit the Kremlin hard. Daily losses of the country are about $300 million. Think about it, every day there are minus $300 million. The Kremlin was feverishly dodging, building a shadow fleet of tankers, mixing its oil with oil from other countries so that it would not be considered Russian according to documents. But the Western countries only tightened the screws. In June, they adopted the 11th package of sanctions. It eliminated most of the loopholes and introduced penalties for companies that helped bypass the restrictions.
This is the first decision in the history of the European Union when violation of European sanctions, circumvention of European sanctions will be penalized, even if it is Central Asian countries or Middle East countries and so on. We've seen sanctions on Turkish companies, we've seen Greek carriers refuse to carry Russian oil, we've seen sanctions on companies in the United Arab Emirates, and all of this has the impact on Russia's ability to circumvent sanctions, which has diminished significantly over the last months, and that trend is going to get even worse from here on, and that means that Russia will sell even less, even cheaper, and get even less money.
This means that it will be increasingly difficult for the aggressor country to replenish its state budget. For the second year already, it has been serving the interests of the Russian top brass and has become a real threat for those who have never taken any part in the war. I'm talking now about Putin's inner circle. The dictator's friends and partners are earning super profits. Their private companies and enterprises get defense state orders. They supply and arm the army with money from the very same state budget. They receive contracts and rebuild cities destroyed by the Russian military in the occupied territories. And for those who are especially loyal, Putin generously gives assets of foreign companies that have decided to shut down business in Russia. Investors are being ripped off, forced to sell their businesses for pennies. All this is presented as protection of national interests and served under the source of nationalization. In reality, this is just plain robbery for the benefit of a bunch of oligarchs who are Putin's loyal supporters. So, some die at war and some make profits from it. The withdrawal of hundreds of companies and international brands has led to an increase in prices. All imports have gone up in price many times over. Twice for medicines, cars from Europe are not imported into Russia, as well as spare parts. The cost of even used cars has soared by 45% over the year. And in comparison with the pre-war period, twice as much. Russ aviation has also fallen under sanctions. The Russian Federation has not sold spare parts and components for airplanes. Catastrophes are inevitable. You have already noticed the almost daily reports of breakdowns and emergency landings, haven't you?
Head on your knees, group yourself together. The smoke was from the engine we were landing on. We all could have burned alive.
The import of components for equipment in factories has also been banned. Accidents are becoming more and more frequent all over the country. Technology, automation are failing, and there is nothing to replace it with. International sanctions promise disaster for the entire Russian economy. Western countries have adopted the 12th package of sanctions. There will be new bans on exports and imports, and on the sale of diamonds from Russia, which is also a significant source of revenue for the Kremlin.
We are now focused on shutting the door on loopholes and continue to cut Russia off from critical supplies. We will restrict trade in Russian diamonds.
Ordinary Russians do not care about diamonds. Not everyone can even buy a couple of $100 and save it for a rainy day. The ruble has depreciated by almost a third in a year. It is recognized as one of the weakest currencies in the world. The central bank has imposed severe restrictions on the currency market. The discount rate was raised to an unprecedented 16%. This has slightly strengthened the ruble, but fix one thing and break the other.
What is an increase in the discount rate? In fact, we press the brakes on the country's development. It's like a car. Raising the discount rate is a brake. That's all. Today, the Central Bank of Russia is again forced to slow down the development of the country, to increase the cost of credit money, to slow down the development of business, and so on, in order to artificially keep the ruble in balance.
The standard of living has fallen rapidly over the year. Every fifth Russian saves money on food by buying cheap products. Now, of course, Muscovites and Petersburgers, whose income level is higher than in the hinterland, will smirk. Yes, if they still have a safety net, many of Russian fellow citizens, especially budgetary employees, have empty wallets. Росстат assures us that inflation is just over 6%. In reality, it is no less than 15%.
15. Ordinary
Russians have become considerably poorer this year, and this is natural. After all, the Kremlin prioritizes spending money on the war, on the defense complex, payments to the mobilized, compensation to the families of the dead. Next year, 70% more money will be spent on military needs than this year. 11 trillion rubles. This is a third of all state budget expenses, a record amount since the collapse of the USSR. They will be saving money on people. The Kremlin has scrapped all medical, road construction, improvement of cities and housing and utilities expenditures. And it's not the sanctions that are to blame.
The sanctions coalition is specifically designing the sanctions so that they hit Russia's military budget as much as possible and hit ordinary Russians as little as possible. But the Russian government, since its priority is the military budget, is rearranging all this within the country so as to shift all the burden, all the negative effect of the sanctions onto ordinary Russians, and the military budget and everything related to the elites that surrounds the Kremlin and so on will be left untouchable.
Russia's economy will continue its steep decline. Oil supplies to India and China will not save it either. After all, they sell them almost for free for yuan and rupees. But the main thing for Putin is to stay afloat somehow. Therefore, he is simply surrendering national interests. Do you remember back in the spring during his visit to Moscow when Xi Jinping felt like a landlord? Dear Mr. Chairman, getting gas and oil for pennies, cutting Russian forests on an industrial scale, filling the Russian market with Chinese goods and turning Russia into a commodity, providing appendage of Beijing.
When you are paid in yuan or rupees, that means that you can spend them, rupees only in India and yuan only in the People's Republic of China. So when Russia receives such currency as payment for its resources, it gets more and more dependent on these countries, on India and on the People's Republic of China. And it can buy less for this money, they can give no discounts, keep the price high for Russia, and offer it lower quality products, realizing that it will buy them anyway.
Without China and India, the Russian economy would have collapsed by now, and with each passing day, the cost of the war for the Russian Federation is increasing. The damage caused to Ukraine by the bloody war is already estimated at an astronomical amount, more than $150 billion, and Russians will pay for all this. The UN General Assembly has recognized Russia as an aggressor state. The register of damage has already been created, and they are already developing developing a mechanism of reparations to Ukraine. Even if Putin refuses to pay, there are options: $300 billion of gold and foreign exchange reserves of the Russian Central Bank are frozen all over the world. The Kremlin will not be able to get them back until it compensates for all the damage done to Ukraine. In the meantime, these funds are taxed. The income from them will be transferred to the reconstruction of Ukraine, while Russia will impoverish.
Россия будет нищать.
But the truth about the causes will not be told to Russians on TV, or they will blame the insidious and hostile collective West for Russia's impoverishment. They will threaten with nuclear weapons, and they will call their citizens to defend Russia's national interest, as they have done so many times before. A lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth. This phrase of the main propagandist of the last millennium, Nazi Joseph Goebbels, has unexpectedly found its continuation in the 21st century in Russia, which has appropriated the victory over Nazism and elevated it to a cult. Having perverted the true purpose of the media as the force power that has to resist the dictatorship, the Kremlin media have become the servants of this regime. While Russian pensioners are counting pennies and families are receiving firewood or a pack of frozen dumplings for their son, husband, and father killed in the war, the Kremlin propagandists are working on the government's agenda and enjoying luxury. Quick math. In 2023, the Kremlin spent 122 billion rubles on the maintenance of its propagandists. Next year, it will spend the same amount. This money could be used to repair dilapidated barracks where millions of Russians still live, to build hospitals and schools. But the Kremlin spent hundreds of billions on lies. Most of this money goes to the fees of propagandists. Don't believe it? A simple example. Here is one of Putin's main heralds, Vladimir Solovyov, in the early 2000s, an oppositionist in a cheap turtleneck and a fighter for freedom of speech who fearlessly opposed Kremlin's censorship.
We are not the wheels of the all-proletarian affairs, of the phrase that the master said and the journalist jumped must be addressed to Tverskaya. A journalist is always an independent person. You can't let the bully take over.
On the other hand, here is Solovyov in the 2022 format, wearing suits by Armani, John Varvatos, and Yoshi Yamamoto. He has acquired real estate in Moscow and elite suburbs and villas in Italy, which, by the way, he had to say goodbye to because of his work for the regime. The money is also used to pay fees to the so-called experts who have taken up their positions on the airwaves.
Most of the experts who appear on Russian talk shows swarm from one talk show to another like a gypsy tribe, voicing messages favorable to the Kremlin. Some of them are former Ukrainian politicians, experts who have fled to Russia. They need to live somehow to make money. There are some Russian citizens who are written in the credits as representatives of the Global Society Institute. As a rule, these institutions are a couple of chairs and some office on the outskirts of Moscow. For them, this is probably the only income they have there.
Resentment, aggression, and hatred are the main emotions bleached by the Kremlin's mouthpieces. They are stamping out hundreds of fakes, which, although absurd, are very lively thanks to their emotionality.
Propaganda doesn't just work aimlessly, just lying about something. There is a goal, a task to mobilize Russian society so that Russian citizens enroll in the army, go to the front so that there are queues at the military enlistment offices. Then there is disinformation, manipulation, fakes about some children, atrocities of the Ukrainian armed forces, shelling of the cities.
Если, например, нужно
If it is necessary to quarrel with our partners, then there are fakes about the fact that the weapons that were supplied to Ukraine turned out to be in the hands of Hamas.
Оказалось, это оружие в руках у Хамаса.
В арсенале пропагандистов
Propagandists have dozens of techniques in their arsenal to brainwash viewers. Substitution of concepts is used to appease the internal audience. Discrediting in order to label every unwanted person as a Nazi or as an enemy, the whole cohort of propagandists under the leadership of Putin's officials have cultivated hatred towards Ukraine and the whole world in Russians. The media are controlled by deputy heads of the presidential administration. Sergei Kirilenko is overseeing the internet, Alexei Gromov television and radio. Top propagandists are regularly gathered in the Kremlin. They are given instructions on what to say and what to keep silent about. Smaller propagandists are given secret manuals, documents with narratives. This Russian tradition began back in the mid-1990s, and the Kremlin is not going to abandon it.
отступать от нее Кремль не намерен.
Российская пропаганда – это не про
Russian propaganda has nothing to do with amateurism. Neither Solovyev nor Kiselyov have the right to their own opinion. They voice who is today's enemy and who is today's friend of the Kremlin. We have been following Russian propaganda, we have been monitoring every day for 10 years. And we have seen many cases when the same Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan suddenly became the enemy of the Kremlin when Turkish troops shot down a Russian airplane, and Turkey became enemy number one for Russia.
для России. Мы тоже
We see the same thing with Ukraine. In 2019, the Kremlin propaganda supported Zelensky. Where is it now? Zelensky is the number one enemy of Russian propaganda.
враг номер один.
И паутина кремлевского агитпропа
And the web of Kremlin propaganda goes far beyond the political shows of the federal channels. Everything is being used, rewritten and completely falsified history, movies, plays, children's cartoons and music. All of this is now aimed at the total militarization of society, from the very diapers to tombstone. The money spent on this is enormous. Think about it. The propaganda film The Witness, which failed miserably at the box office, cost 200 million rubles.
200 миллионов рублей.
Пропаганда, вот она эффективна, когда она тотальна.
Propaganda is effective when it is total. When you go to a music concert and they tell you about Putin, about the greatness of Russia. You go to the movies, it's all there. You watch TV, it's all there. It's one of the elements of the information bubble in which Russians have been placed.
Пузыря, в который поместили россиян.
Именно потому
This is why the theaters fell under the oppression of propaganda. They were obliged to stage plays approved by the authorities, so-called patriotic plays. And for the slightest deviation from the Kremlin's methodology, daredevils are swamped with denunciations, fired and persecuted. After all, the viewer should see that the actors and directors, in a single impulse, support the Russian war against Ukraine.
подобное
Such a demonstration of exclusive unity is now in all spheres of life in Russia. This is how those who disagree with Putin's regime are instilled with a sense of guilt and loneliness, confusion and detachment to make them doubt their beliefs and join the fanatical supporters of the war.
сторонникам войны.
Такой, какой есть, и меня не сломать. И все потому, что я русский.
Музыка стала одним
Music has become one of the Kremlin's most powerful tools. One-day artists and pop antiques compose songs of praise for Putin and the regime.
и режиму.
Эх, Россия, матушка, в бой готов, сарматушка. Россия, моя Россия. Не заставить Россию покорно идти по указанным кем-то местам.
Поддержав путинскую
By supporting Putin's aggression, they got a chance for popularity and huge earnings. By entertaining you, they distract you from the truth about the honors of war and the scale of war crimes of the Russian army in Ukraine. they whitewash and justify the actions of the Russian president, who is neither going to the Hague nor to the dustbin of history. They are agitating for the continuation of the war, convincing you of their own, generously paid by the Kremlin, truth.
Кремлем, правде. В праздничную
On the New Year's Eve, they will appear on the screens of Russians in their traditional New Year's show. They will declare their love for Russia, praise Putin, and be proud of the so-called defenders of the motherland, which no one has attacked. And they will keep silent about the fact that on the threshold of the new year 2024, the country is already in the abyss of dictatorship, totalitarianism, lawlessness, and economic recession.
рецессии.